Hello, everybody. Thank you for all the people who have come to listen to this talk. And thank you very much to Theo for your nice introduction. I'm going to present the methodological considerations that we made before starting work on the implementation of a computerized system for the screening of developmental language disorders and reading disorders in multilingual children. So I have tried to prepare a presentation that can give you an idea of the complexity which is behind what can seem a very easy task, just implementing tasks for language and for reading. First of all, I need to make a general introduction on what neurodevelopmental disorders are, because maybe not everybody is familiar with these topics. There have been some changes in the diagnostic manuals in the last years. The neurodevelopmental cluster in DSM-5 and in ICD-11 is nowadays characterized by a special attention to the role of genetic factors, to the early age of onset, which is one of the requirements in order to make a diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental disorders, a continuing course of the disorder, the presence of comorbidity within cluster, so the presence of multiple manifestations of the same disorder in different domains, and the salience of cognitive symptoms. So neurodevelopmental disorders have many different symptoms, but the main role is played by cognitive symptoms. Neurodevelopmental disorders are a real problem in our society because very often they are not diagnosed. So some children experience learning difficulties or language difficulties in the presence or often in the absence of a clinical diagnosis. And this is due to neurodevelopmental diversity, so to the very heterogeneous manifestations of these disorders, which make it difficult to detect them. 14 to 30% of children and adolescents worldwide experience some barriers to learning. And these problems can vary widely in scope and impact. Some children are formally diagnosed through specialist health or education services, and they are placed in categories. And what we will focus on today is dyslexia and developmental language disorder. The diagnostic criteria, according to ICD-11 for developmental language disorders, are, as we already said before, that such disorders arise during the developmental period, so very early in life, and are characterized by difficulties in understanding or producing speech and language, or in using language in context for the purposes of communication. These problems must be outside the limits of normal variation expected for age and level of intellectual functioning. We know that variation for age is huge for very young children. And it is not easy to determine exactly what you have to expect as a function of intellectual level. But I mean, this is a controversial issue that is not the focus of this talk. The observed speech and language problems are not attributable to regional, social, or cultural and ethnic language variations. So this is one of the diagnostic criteria, and this is the criterion that has an impact on our research, meaning which becomes a problem when you have to deal with bilingual population or multilingual populations, because very often these children belong to social or ethnic minorities which do not share exactly the same social and the same linguistic background as the children that you have to compare them to. So the children who were the basis for the language tests that you use. You have to exclude anatomical or neurological abnormalities. The presumptive etiology for so the nature, the origin of developmental speech or language disorders is complex, and in many individual cases it remains unknown. I shift immediately to the diagnostic criteria for dyslexia, developmental dyslexia, because there are many analogies with the criteria for the diagnosis of developmental language disorder. Developmental learning disorders with impairment in reading, because now the actual classifications do not separate domains of learning disorders as they did before. So there is no diagnosis of developmental dyslexia. There is a general diagnosis of developmental learning disorder, but it is specified that impairment is especially present for reading. And it is characterized by significant and persistent difficulties in learning academic skills related to reading, such as word reading accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. The individual's performance in reading is markedly below what would be expected for chronological age and general level of intellectual functioning. So this is, again, a change with respect to what it was before, because it says it is markedly below. It does not give exactly the cutoff, which was given in the previous versions of both ICD-10 and DSM-4. So it says it has to be below and markedly below, so significantly below. It is not very well specified, but usually we say in order to be not attributable to normal variation and to the presence of errors and noise in assessment, the cutoff is 2 standard deviations below the mean, or 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. And it has to have an impact on the individual's academic or occupational functioning. Developmental learning disorders first manifest when academic skills are taught during the early school years, so language, first years of life, reading disorders when you learn to read. The developmental learning disorder with impairment in reading is not due to intellectual development problems, sensory impairment, neurological or motor disorders. And again, we have a specification which constitutes an issue when you're dealing with multilingual population. Lack of availability of education, lack of proficiency in the language or of academic instruction, or psychosocial adversity. So we see that we have a problem in diagnosis that has to be solved. As to language, the diagnosis of language disorder, we have to focus on a sort of paradox, which is when you have to diagnose a child who is very young, the probability that your diagnosis is correct, so the predictivity of diagnosis, the probability that the child will really have a language disorder that is persistent over time is very low. So many late talkers, children who have a language delay, catch up after 3 years, and many DLD children were not late talkers. At 3-4 years, predictivity increases. So especially when more language domains are impaired, you have a better probability that the disorder that you observe is really persistent. It is only at 5 years of age and beyond that predictivity is finally high. But at this time, the possibility to deliver effective treatment is very low. So the problems that you detect at 5 years of age are very likely to be persistent, meaning also that they are likely to be resistant to treatment. So if you make a diagnosis very early, you are likely to overdiagnose, to make a diagnosis for children who would catch up anyway. But if you wait too long, you have a reliable, stable diagnosis, but no means to change the developmental trajectory of the children. So this highlights the importance to have early, reliable, and cost-effective screening tools for at-risk cases. So they must be early in order to be able to intervene. They must be reliable, so as stable and as predictive as possible. And they must be cost-effective, meaning that you know that many of the children you will identify through the screening procedures or through early diagnostic approaches will probably be false positives, so children who are not really developmental language disordered children, but you can afford it. So you can also afford giving help and support to these children who are not really in need, but you still don't know. The characteristics of the population with developmental language disorder is especially linked to its high variability in time of the linguistic profiles of these children. So the language difficulties that you detect and describe at a certain age, even when they are apparently resolved, maybe through training, are very likely to present again in a subsequent developmental stage in possibly very different forms. For example, phonological language problems are likely to manifest again when the child is in the first or second year of schooling as reading problems, but when the child is in middle school or at advanced schooling stages, it may be that he will show difficulties in text comprehension and text production. So there is a continuity between some cases of developmental language disorders and developmental dyslexia. Does this mean that we can use the same markers for screening? No, because even if there is an overlap between the two disorders, there are two different disorders. Not only because they manifest in different stages of development, and not only because they manifest themselves in different abilities, first language and then reading, but because their nature is different. Even if dyslexic children often have some linguistic deficits, especially and almost always have phonological deficits, but sometimes they also have problems in other domains of language. Developmental dyslexia is not, or not only, a language disorder. The neuropsychological basis of developmental dyslexia are usually described as multifactorial. So all the new theories and approaches to reading disorders highlight this multifactorial nature. Phonological difficulties are crucial and probably interact with other neurocognitive risk factors and with protective factors, but phonological difficulties alone are not sufficient to cause dyslexia. Even when we focus on phonological problems, deficits are not limited to phonemes. There is a possible or a very likely role of non-linguistic factors, including visual attention, auditory discrimination, and so on. When we look at language abilities, we can highlight problems in linguistic domains that go beyond phonology and that sometimes include also the morphosyntactic domain or other domains of language. The point is what kind of test and how sensitive a test you use to address these abilities and to assess them. Given all these characteristics, can bilingualism make diagnosis of developmental language disorders and reading disorders more problematic? Yes, especially when the L2 is acquired late or the exposure to the L2 is for other reasons insufficient or inadequate. For example, especially in some linguistic minorities, parents and relatives, even if they live in the L2 country, do not speak L2, or they speak L2 with many difficulties. So the language to which the child is exposed in the family can be a non-perfect version of the L2. And this adds to the normal interference that is generated between L1 and L2 in bilingual or multilingual contexts. We have heard in this series of talks a wonderful talk by Judith Kroll, who highlighted a series of characteristics of this interaction between the L1 and the L2, focusing and describing L2 learning as a dynamic system, where the L1 is affected by the L2 and not only the reverse. The two languages are dynamically interacting, and they differ both between and within bilingual speakers. So also the same speaker can have different characteristics and have a different pattern of his bilingual abilities when immersed in different contexts. The system for language learning is adaptive, and there are not only linguistic but also cognitive factors that contribute to the interaction between the two languages. Especially, we have seen very nice examples also from other talks of the impact that executive functions and inhibition and control have on the ability to suppress one language in order to speak the other one correctly. So interference between the second and first language are a normal phenomenon, and the permeability across the two languages make early and late L2 learners more similar to each other than was thought before, when it seemed that the time of acquisition was one of the main factors. Now we know that it is important, of course, but it is not so determinant as it was said before. So, as we already said, cross-language interactions are bidirectional, and they render the bilinguals two languages functionally distinct from the native language of monolingual speakers. So a bilingual speaker of a language is never exactly the same as a monolingual speaker of that language. We refer to the very well-known icebergs model of language interdependence, knowing that there is a common underlying proficiency of the various languages that a person can speak, and the languages appear over the surface with their specific surface language features, which are more diverse than the common basis, which is hidden beyond the surface. So there is constant transfer in language, and we know that transfer can be seen in many language abilities. For example, this study by Verhoeven and et al. In 2012 studied, examined language abilities of Turkish-Dutch bilingual children with language disorders between 7 and 11 years in the Netherlands. And they found medium to high correlations between phonological memory, phonological awareness, grammatical skills, and story comprehension in the two languages. So the two languages are correlated, so they have this common structure that determines and contributes to their correlation. And in fact, children's L2 proficiency levels could be explained by their proficiency levels in L1, also at the statistical level, even after controlling for the effect of other cognitive factors and confounders. Turning to reading, we have a CODAS model, which describes the interactions and also the interference that the two languages can have when learning to read a second language. CODA reminds us that reading is a complex, multifaceted construct comprising a number of sub-skills, so it's not a one single ability. It requires the acquisition of those various sub-skills which are affected by the linguistic knowledge from the two languages. And in L2 reading, sub-skill development always involves the two languages at the same time. So the mechanisms in learning L2 reading are described by CODA's model as input-based computational processes, which are constituted by detection, abstraction, and implicit application of regularities. And it is possible to identify both reading universals and language-specific components, like, for example, metalinguistic competence, which concerns not only phonology, but also syntax and morphology. Even when using only one of their languages, bilinguals often access linguistic and orthographic representation of their other language. And such tight interaction between the two languages facilitates the bidirectional sharing or transfer of literacy knowledge gained in one language towards learning to read in another language. And here you can recognize the iceberg model again. Bilingual children who learn to read in two alphabetic orthographies have shown that children with dyslexia present with similar reading deficits in both the languages. And these deficits are likely to be phonological, especially related to phonemic awareness, and they may hamper children's acquisition of print to sound correspondences in both of the languages. This, however, does not preclude bilingual children with dyslexia from developing language-specific reading strategies to face the task of reading, to afford the difficulties that are linked with reading in each of the two languages through language-specific strategies. In general, studies on bilingual children with dyslexia have mainly focused on children speaking Western languages, so with alphabetic systems. But a very interesting line of research is constituted by the studies that focused on children who learn to read an alphabetic and a non-alphabetic system like Chinese. So there are children with Chinese-only reading impairments, which, as we said, does not seem to be the case for the combination of two alphabetic systems where individuals who are dyslexic in one language are also dyslexic in the other language. But as we said, Chinese can constitute an exception, and there are individuals who are dyslexic only in Chinese and not in the alphabetic language. And in this case, their impairments are usually characterized by deficits in morphological awareness. So the ability to manipulate the smallest units of meaning, so the morphemes. I found an interesting model by Bernard trying to describe learning to read in two languages as a compensatory process where weaknesses in one area can be compensated by knowledge in another area in language. So according to the studies by this group, L1 literacy accounts for up to 20% of a reader's L2 reading comprehension. L2 language knowledge accounts for another 30%, and the remaining 50% of the variance is unexplained. Explained variance between reading comprehension, so due to the interaction between the two languages and the two orthographic and reading abilities, vary with the linguistic distance between the two languages. So linguistic distance has, of course, a very relevant impact on the degree and the way in which the two languages interact and possibly influence each other in a positive but also in a negative way. A study by Pasquarella and colleagues focus on transfer in reading, and they also highlight how this type of transfer varies with the linguistic distance between the two languages. And as we saw for language disorders, also, for language learning in two languages, also for learning to read in two languages, they identify two types of processes that put the two languages into a relationship. Language universal, in this case, script universal process, where the L1 resources that are used to develop L2 proficiency are important regardless of the specific language that is learned in its written form. And this study that compares transfer of word reading fluency in two groups of bilingual children. One group speaking and learning to read Spanish and English, the other group learning to read Chinese and English. They found that the lack of associations between Chinese and English that was found instead for Spanish and English supports the notion that transfer of word reading accuracy is a script-specific process that operates on similarities between L1 and L2. So again, we have a script universal part of abilities and processes that explain the learning of reading in different languages, but also script-specific processes that make languages that are very distant from each other sort of independent groups where there is no positive transfer from one language to the other one, but also no interference from one language to the other. A similar kind of results is brought by this study by Breivik et al., where they tried to see how the proficiency in L2 reading was explained and was corresponding to proficiency in the L1. And they saw that only about half of the children who were poor in their L2 reading were also poor in their L1 reading. And another half had a discrepancy between the two languages. So they were poor readers in the L2, but not in the L1. So this is again an evidence in support of this language specific or script specific portion of the interaction between the languages in the written forms, which, as the the authors of this study highlight does not only depend on the linguistic characteristics of the scripts, but also on social and various environmental factors. So there are cultural factors that can additionally interfere with diagnosis and make it more uncertain. For example, different value systems in different social linguistic minorities. For example, the view of the meaning of school success, of reading, of learning, what is passed in the families about the importance and the meaning of being successful at school, different attitude towards cognitive evaluation and the evaluator, and possible interference of the value systems of the culture of origin on the cognitive evaluation. For example, sometimes we use tests which are not culture-free, but have a strong cultural bias especially in some tasks or subtests. And also the different educational methods in the family can have an impact on how the child faces learning, faces his schooling experience, and also how they face the testing situation. Here there is a graph illustrating the degree of success in schooling in monolingual and non-monolingual, or say in this case immigrant children from immigrant families in the Italian schools. You can see that children who have a non-native Italian family have lower levels of success in school. This is in primary school, this is in secondary school, even more discrepant, as you can see. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Yes, okay. You can see that the discrepancy between the two groups is even larger. And in the second grade secondary school, so this is middle school and this is high school, the gap increases even more. So being born in a non-native Italian family is a disadvantage for children in their school success, and this is a fact. These are data from the Ministry of School of Education in Italy. So it is extremely important to address the problem of school failure, because in those children and adolescents who fail at school, there are surely at least 5%, which is the normal percentage of learning disorders in the population, of individuals who have a learning problem, a specific learning disorder, and we may not be able to diagnose it and to give them the support that they need in order to overcome the problems. So what do we need in order to be able to make a correct diagnosis? In general, so not only in the bilingual population, we need to have testing tools which are valid, reliable, useful, predictive of future development, and accurate at diagnostic level. So they must have a good sensitivity and good specificity. Sensitivity is the ability to detect those children who really have a problem, and specificity is the ability to not include or not diagnose children who don't have a problem. So we must be sensitive to the presence of the problem, but only to the presence of the problem, not leading to false diagnosis of a problem when the problem does not exist. So this is how you calculate sensitivity, which is the amount of true positives on the total of true positives and false negatives. So the children who are detected by the task, by the test, as having the problem and really have the problem. And these are the children, the false negatives, who are not detected, but they do have the problem. Specificity is the ratio between true negatives, so the children who really don't have the problem, and the total number of children who are not screened by the test. So the sum of the true negatives and the false positives. So the ones who appear to have a problem, but do not really have it. Sensitivity and specificity have a complementary relationship to each other. So meaning that when you try to increase sensitivity, you inevitably decrease specificity, and vice versa. In order to put together the information that you have from sensitivity and from specificity, you generally use what is called the ROC curve, so receiver operating characteristics, which is a graph where you have this curve representing the function mapping sensitivity with 100 minus specificity, so the complement of specificity, where the desirable curve is as much as possible close to this angle, okay? So to this corner, okay? So this curve would be characteristic of a very good test, where both sensitivity and specificity are as high as possible. So how do we address the construction of a screening test or a close to diagnostic battery of tests that can be useful for the bilingual population? Here, there are the steps that we followed. So we looked for language-specific markers of specific learning language disorders and developmental dyslexia in the monolingual population. We checked whether these markers have been validated also in the bilingual population. We selected markers that are appropriate for specific language pairs, constructed tasks in one or two languages for each pair, and validated the test through item analysis and selection and non-collection. Not all of the steps have been completed now, but that's what the PhD student, Maren Eikerling, who is working on this specific project, is doing during her PhD project. So starting from the first step, looking for language-specific markers of the two disorders in the monolingual population. What is a clinical marker of a disorder? It must be characteristic of the population with the disorder. It must be stable, so not only a transient characteristic, but something which allows to predict future performance and status. It must be reliable, so it must be measurable with sufficient accuracy. It must be discriminative, so able to distinguish among the populations which have and do not have the disorder. This means, in order to know all these pieces of information, we should have studies providing data on discriminative power, so the differences between affected and unaffected populations, in terms of specificity and sensitivity, as we saw before, predictive value, correlations with future performances and outcomes. So we need to have longitudinal studies that can tell whether a certain measure that we apply now to the population is able to predict the status and the performance of that population in 1 or more years, in a certain amount of time. Predictive value, as we saw, and validity. So how much a certain test is really measuring what it declares and wishes to measure, which is evidenced through the correlations with other tests that have already been validated and that measure the same ability. So having finding studies with those characteristics and so giving information on the clinical markers is unexpectedly very difficult, because most of the studies on monolingual and also on bilingual population give information about means. So they show that groups of children, groups of individuals with certain characteristics, for example, monolinguals, bilinguals, typically developing, and children or individuals with specific language impairment, differ in some measures. But differ means that I take the average measure in one group and the average measure in another group, I compare them and I find a significant difference. This is not enough to say that that measure is a clinical marker, because I don't know whether the difference in means comes from a few individuals who have very different scores on that measure, and that change the mean in a very effective way, because the scores are very deviant from the other group, or if there is maybe a more limited difference in the values, but this difference is common to all the individuals in the group. So I could have a group where the individuals have all a different score in that measure, and in this case, even if the difference is small, the measure would be a good clinical marker because it is common to all the individuals. Or maybe there is a subgroup which has deviant score, but also a subgroup which does not have deviant scores. So if I use that marker to detect the presence of a disorder, I could be completely misled by that measure, because maybe the individuals or the child that I assess does not have a deviant score. So I could wrongly conclude that he is not a child with a developmental disorder. Okay, so studies just giving information on average differences are not enough. We need to have this kind of information that we saw before, which is the ROC curve, saying how many of the children or of the individuals in that group would be correctly diagnosed by using that measure. And I can tell you that studies with these characteristics are extremely few, extremely rare. Here you see the results or the characteristics of a systematic review by Shamamud and colleagues, which had the goal of evaluating accuracy of tests and psycholinguistics measures for the identification of monolingual children in preschool age with specific language impairment with respect to the TD children. And out of 289 studies, they selected only 23 studies, which, as you can see in the map, concern languages in the whole world. Most of the majority of the studies are in English, but there are also studies on Cantonese, Hebrew, Persian, Italian, French, Spanish, and Slovakian. What the authors say that we can consider a diagnostic procedure as usable, as allowed for the identification of a specific population only when its sensitivity and specificity are acceptable. And as you will see, those few studies that gave information about sensitivity and specificity had included very low levels of these two parameters. So many of those studies, even if they described performances that were different in TD children and SLI children or children with ELD, still did not possess, did not have the psychometric characteristics that make a certain measure a good marker of impairment. So the authors claim that there is a terrible need for studies which give information about this kind of parameters, so diagnostic accuracy. And they give an overview of tests with acceptable values, non-acceptable values, and variable values. So there are tests of grammatical production, especially in English, and tests of phonological ability like nonword repetition that have, at least in some of the studies, good, so acceptable sensitivity and specificity values. Surprisingly, some tests tapping vocabulary or narrative production did not turn out to have acceptable values. For Italian, especially, and Italian is one of the languages we focused on, measures which had good, acceptable specificity and sensitivity were word repetition, non-word repetition, and some psycholinguistic measures such as use of clitics, use of articles, and use of third-person plural verb inflections. So we focused and selected some of the clinical markers that we found and checked whether these markers have been validated in the bilingual population. And also here, there are not many studies addressing exactly those markers, but there are some of the markers that we saw have been tested in the bilingual population. Practically never do we have information about diagnostic accuracy. Anyway, in general, we know that exposure to different phonological systems favors phonological awareness even in children who's reduced with reduced L2 mastery. And we know that lack of mastery in certain language predicts comprehension but not decoding. This is something that had to do with the specific markers for reading that we focused on. This study by Bender, De Fitto and Melloni with 111 school-age children, of whom some were Italian monolingual controls and some others, half of the sample were bilingual controls. Performed a repetition task, non-word repetition task with 40 non-words, and it was confirmed that both groups of dyslexics, so monolingual and bilingual, underperform controls at each syllable length, whereas there were no differences between monolingual and bilingual controls. So it is confirmed that non-word repetition is a good test for also in the bilingual population. Other studies further support the use of this test, showing that children from immigrant families do not have any problem in non-word reading. So again, if a child has a low score in non-word reading, it should not be attributed to bilingualism. So the litmus project is the one that provided much of the materials that we used for both the lexical and the non-word repetition tests that we used. The markers that we chose had to be appropriate for each of the language pairs we focused on. And the language pairs we decided to study, depending on usefulness, feasibility, and scientific interest, were Italian, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, Italian, English, and German, Italian. The markers that had to be language specific and age appropriate and that had been shown to be discriminant in the literature between the two populations of language or reading disorder and TD children, also had to be distinctive for each language pair. So we did not choose the same markers for a certain language independently of the second language it had to be paired with, but considering the linguistic distance between the two languages, because we saw that the linguistic difference and distance is important in producing possible interference. So we did not have parallel versions in L1 and L2, although we had tests for both L1 and L2. For preschool children with DLD, we focused on language learning in L1, and for children, school-age children with DD, for the detection of at-risk children, we focused on reading learning in DL2, because DL2 is the language in which the children learn to read, while L1 is the language in which the children learn to speak. So the focus was on the two different components of their bilingualism in the two age groups, and for the two different goals of detecting language and reading disorders. The markers that we selected were both static and dynamic tools. Static assessment included phonology, lexicon, morphosyntax, reading, phonological awareness, and some language-specific tasks. For example, visual aspects of characters in Chinese. And we also had dynamic assessment, which has been shown to be very fruitful for detecting language and reading problems in bilingual populations. So we had two dynamic assessment tasks. One assessing novel word learning in DLD, and one assessing novel script learning for DD, so assessing the ability to learn a new writing and a new orthographic system. This is the overview of all the tests that we selected for DLD and for DD. The challenge was especially for selecting participants with problems, because we highlighted how difficult it is to make a diagnosis of DLD and DD in the bilingual population, but we need to have diagnosed children in order to validate the test. So we did select the population, but also we tried to have multiple sources of information, not only tests, including teacher and parents questionnaires, clinician data and questionnaires, and we built the tasks that are now implemented in a platform. They had to be easy to implement, and for them, automatic correction and scoring had to be possible, not too long, and wide-ranging, so as to give converging information and evidence to make conclusions more reliable. We have implemented both experimental screening tasks and indirect information sources, so parents questionnaires, teacher questionnaires, and clinicians questionnaires, and we have collected data on standardized testing tools. And we are now in the in the process of validating. We had some piloting phases, and this is an overview of what we obtained in the group of German, Italian DLD children, well, no, DLD screening, so with the children, of whom most were TD children, but some were at risk children. Here you see the distribution of scores in subject-verb agreement tasks for German in 3 different risk factor levels. So here are the TD children. Here are the children who have a risk of being DLD, and here are children who have a diagnosis of DLD. You can see how the distribution of the scores on the experimental tasks, on the newly built tasks, is different. There is a correlation between the risk factor level and scores, and there is a correlation with other standardized tests giving the same kind of information. The same is true for passive vocabulary measures. You see the scores obtained with the CLT German noun comprehension and Peabody picture vocabulary test in German, very similar, with good correlations, 0.86, and again a good correlation with risk factor, even if a little bit lower than before. Here we have the same situation for nonword repetition tasks, for which we still have to make finer analysis. We now have a whole word scoring. We will have detailed analysis on phoneme and syllable level. But already the scores give good results in terms of correlations with standardized tests, so convergent validity. The same was obtained with a clinical population of DLD children who had the dynamic assessment of both in Spanish and Italian, and you can see how the learning of a new, so to say, Spanish words is easier for those children than learning new Italian words. So there are differences between the L1 and L2, even if in their spoken language they are not detectable. And the conclusions are that discriminant validity up to now is satisfactory. Convergent validity is also positive. So we have significant correlations between screening, experimental tasks and standardized tasks. And we are collecting good feedback from both the users and the children who used the tests, so both the examiners and the children. Thank you. Sorry for being late.